To the honorees, Dr. Mahamba, program participants, ladies and gentlemen, greetings from Bethany United Methodist Church, Reverend Anise Moses, New Orleans, Louisiana. I didn't get the message about the time, guys, so bear with me, huh? Mr. MC, I got a little history with this church, so let me say a few things, okay? On being asked to take part in this program, I was overjoyed. To say it's a homecoming for me is an understatement. Coming back to Huntsville is one thing, but coming back to Lakeside Church takes it to another level. Whatever I am today is in large part a reflection of the values passed on to me through my mama and the sainted souls who comprise the membership of this holy place. From my earliest days, I recall the outstanding ministers of my boyhood, Reverend Wilson, Reverend Houston, Reverend Bridges. I remember the scholars and college administrators, Dean Carter, Dr. Chambers, my coaches, Mr. Kellum, Mr. Davis, the older boys of the church who also served as my mentors, the Cliff brothers, the Hyder brothers, Pearl Johnson. Among these exemplars, there was yet another fellow who would play a key role in my development. Not quite as old as the elders I just mentioned, not quite as young as the latter group I just mentioned. He had a most profound impact on me as a schoolboy. I'm speaking, of course, of none other than today's honoree, Mr. Isaac Rooks. My earliest memories of Mr. Rooks go back to his delivery of the church announcements each Sunday. Lean, clean. He presented the church news as well as the happenings from the larger black community. And he did it with an unmatched eloquence. I eagerly anticipated his dispatch of this responsibility each Sunday. He did it with such control, ease, effectiveness, that I early on got an understanding and appreciation for the power of words, the importance of language, good communications. As a member of the choir, he frequently was featured soloist also. I particularly looked forward to hearing his rich baritone in his soulful renderings of harvest and Easter special songs. You know, harvest wasn't harvest until I'd heard him sing, "Sinner, please don't let this harvest pass." Easter wasn't Easter until I heard him do, "Were you there?" In much the same way that I credit him with quickening my appreciation for good communicative ability, I thank him also for the role he played in showing me the nobility and beauty of the African American musical tradition, particularly the beauty of the spiritual, that wondrous and unique creation lauded by the great W.B. Du Bois in the souls of black folk. But his role in my musical education went much further than that. He also opened my mind up to the power of the total jazz blues continuum. I'll say a little more about that later. But on reaching the 7th grade at the William Hooper Council High School, I was fortunate enough to be placed under the full-time tutelage of Mr. Rooks, who took the place of Mr. Charles Brandon. When I look back on that critical point in my development, I realized what a tremendous blessing it was. It was a blessing in that all those vibes I was picking up serendipitously would now be directed to me and my classmates with a powerful focus and intentionality. A remarkable teacher of social studies, he expected us to keep up with current events, this for the first time for all of us, and to express ourselves intelligently in discussion thereof. These same expectations held true for our later interaction with him in such senior high school offerings as world history, course offerings that he made relevant and exciting. He was especially demanding also in preparing his students for presentations before the total student body, You know, we had to do this in chapel programs, each class, homerooms, and so on. Whether you were in one of his theatrical productions or some other offering, if you represented Mr. Rooks, you had to have your stuff together. I have a difficult time realizing that it was almost 60 years that Mr. Rooks walked into that aforementioned class of raucous seventh graders at council. I've heard him talk about it on one of Richie Crimes's videos, and he talks about how nervous he was. I don't think he was ever nervous a day in his life. We don't believe it. He was one cool dude. And Leo, I don't believe that about that tie either. He had a suit for every day, okay? Not only that, with the Mr. B collars that he wore, you know, the way Billy Eckstine wore his, with that roll and a necktie about this thin, you know. He was our model. Not only that, we thought he had the hippest car in the world. He had a little 55 Ford Victoria, I believe, blue on blue. Big white wall tires, fender skirts. Oh, we just knew that he was it. He also evidenced his difference even in the songs that he taught us in the morning devotionals. You know, we had tired of the old nursery rhymes, and even the patriotic tunes wore a little thin by now. He started introducing us to things like Look for the Silver Lining and Trees, you know, tunes that were jazz standards by people like Chet Baker and Al Hibbler, you know. He taught us these songs by singing them to us in his mellifluous baritone, and sometimes even bringing his alto saxophone to class to play along with our singing. This was, by the way, in the year that Council got its first marching band, so he became an inspiration to those of us who were trying to learn an instrument, and moreover, some of us who were trying to start our own little rhythm and blues and jazz bands. I'll never forget his joining us in the chapel program for a rendition of the bebop classic by Charlie Parker called Now's the Time. We were familiar with that song in a corrupted version called the Hucklebuck. But he said, no, you got to call it Now's the Time, you know, so you can show you're really hip. Yeah. But he played with us in a chapel program on that very song. I tried to get him to bring his axe today, but he wouldn't do it, you know. Next time, all right? Of course, it's impossible to talk about Mr. Rooks without noting his love and knowledge of sports. You all know him as the voice of the Bulldogs, but I recall him and some of his earlier endeavors in the realm of sports. We called him, and we knew him as the voice of the Tigers. He not only served as the announcer for Council's football games, he also, and personally, saw that the local newspaper carried coverage of Council's games. To guarantee that happened, he wrote the stories, and thanks to him, black boys in this town saw their names in the Huntsville Times on Saturdays and Sundays, telling what they did on Friday nights. I might add that he also served a stint as track coach at Council, and in doing so, he wasn't afraid to challenge some of the hot shots on the team. You know, he could still run a little bit, and I'm talking about we had people like Thito Franklin, Nip, you know, and folk like that on the track team, and he inspired more interest in track there for a while, too. Track was never given the interest that football and basketball were. Mr. Rooks dazzled us with his many gifts and his zest for life. Bona fide scholar, musician, athlete, sports journalist, he embodied the ideal of being all that you can be long before the Army picked that up. I've said it before and I'll say it again. He was our John Hope Franklin, our Charlie Parker, our Billy Eckstine, Jesse Owens, and Mike Tirico all rolled up in one. Despite my being mesmerized by his prodigious talents, there's one small personal exchange that has remained most prominent in my memory. It goes back to that 7th grade class. One day, a particularly irksome young lady tried my patience. Among the several indignities she thrust upon me was a most uncharitable name. I responded in kind. Mr. Rooks heard me. Called me to the side and almost in a whisper asked, "Do you remember what you did yesterday?" That was his way of telling me that he had been here at Lakeside Church, the one downtown, to see me answer the call to Christian discipleship. And moreover, he expected me to walk the walk. I don't have to tell you how far we've gotten from that in schools today. Mr. Rooks, like most of the teachers of that era, guaranteed a seamless connection between the church and the school. Along with his subject matter, he taught Christian values, morality. For that, I'm thankful. Through the years, I've maintained a contact with my mentor and friend, and I use that word pointedly as I can, for that is indeed what we've become over the years. I was reminded of the depth of that friendship a year or so ago as I went about the never-ending task of cleaning out my mama's house. I ran across a letter that Mr. Rooks wrote me while I was toiling in the pledge club of the Omega Psi Phi fraternity. Needless to say, I was tremendously moved and encouraged by that letter at the time that it was written, in much the same way that I am with our frequent telephone chats today. Whether we are talking about classic jazz recordings, major sporting events, memorable personalities and happenings from Huntsville's past, our children, our grandchildren, the aches and pains and general challenges of aging, I have to remind him that these few years between him and me, nothing like it was, you know. I can empathize with a lot of that stuff he talks about these days. But I leave each of those exchanges feeling rejuvenated and blessed. In closing, I'd like to say thanks to you, Mr. Rooks, for letting your light shine so brightly and so selflessly for this region. I'd like to thank you, however, specifically on behalf of the legions of students whose lives you've touched through the years. And there are a number of them here today. I would be remiss if I didn't also express my thanks to your family, your wife Nancy and your son Sonny, for their support and willingness to share you with us all through the years. And so that I can go home without too much trouble, I want you to know, Mr. Rooks, that I didn't put my wife's name on my little ad for the book for you. She is one of your admirers too. So please, so I can get in the car and go home, look at it and add her name to that, please, okay? Thank you very much.